We're continuing in Hebrews chapter 2, talking about this comparison between Jesus and angels. And in the chapter 1 part of this discussion, we see that Jesus is this better messenger. He's this messenger with more authority. He's God himself delivering the message himself. But as we get into chapter 2, we see the significance in this of Jesus becoming human, of Jesus coming in the flesh, which is something that the angels never did. Yes, the angels may have at various points taken human appearance, but they didn't, again in the words of the Apostle John, they didn't become flesh and dwell among us. And so here, the writer of Hebrews looks back to the Old Testament. And that's one of the things as you're reading the book of Hebrews to keep in mind, is that this book is heavily based on things that happened back in the Old Testament and things that were said in the Old Testament and done in the Old Testament. Later on, we're going to talk about the Levitical priesthood and all those things. And so notice when the writer refers back, and maybe go look those things up. But here he goes back to Psalm 8. Psalm 8, this song, the psalm of praise to God. O Lord, our Lord, how great is your name in all the earth. And he brings out this section. He says, what is man that you remember him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him lower than the angels for a short time. You crowned him with glory and honor and subjected everything under his feet. Now, as we read that psalm, the psalmist is just talking about God putting man, generally speaking, speaking of mankind, in this role over all of creation. But now here he applies it to Jesus, and specifically Jesus as the Son of Man, who was made lower than the angels. Not because somehow the angels outranked him, but because of this taking on human form, living as us, becoming man. Not that he stopped being God, but he took on this physical body. But he did this, the writer says, so that by God's grace he might taste death for everyone, and then be crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death. Now, what's the big deal about this? Jesus did something the angels didn't do. Jesus did something that the prophets couldn't do. Really, the angels couldn't do it either. Jesus died for us. We'll see in some of the other letters that we'll look at this quarter about God's love being shown in Jesus coming to earth. Some call the Bible a collection of love letters from God, talking about God's love for man. And really going back to chapter 1, we can see this parallel because the Old Testament writers and even the New Testament writers tell us about God's love for man. Jesus didn't just talk about love. He showed us love. He demonstrated love through his death. But this served a purpose. By dying and then by rising, Jesus showed the power that he had, the power that God has over death and over the devil. By Jesus dying and rising, he gives us hope. He frees us from the fear of death as the end of it. But also, he did it so that he could be a priest for us, so that he could be the intermediary, the go-between between God and man. He's not some advocate who's never experienced things. He has lived as one of us. He knows what it's like to be human. He knows He knows what we go through. He knows the temptations we face. Yes, he overcame them. Yes, he lived perfectly, but he still faced them, which makes him the one to appeal to God for us. And this is something that Jesus does for us, not for the angels, not to help angels, but for Abraham's offspring, for us, for those who would follow like Abraham and live faithfully for God. But he did this to be that merciful high priest, which we'll talk about in future readings. But as you read chapter 2, understand, like in chapter 1, Jesus presents us with something that we couldn't realize if we just had the prophets, if we just had angels. He brings us something that we can't realize if we're left to our own devices. And that makes him, so much better than what we would have without him.